لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقهوا قولي. Assalamu alaikum, everyone. So alhamdulillah, I love, coming into these rooms, and you never can tell, is there going to be like one person in attendance? Is it going to be several people? But I see that in this room, there are a lot of people who are here because this is a topic that's so important to us. Whether we are parents, whether we are youth, whether we are educators, whether we are community leaders, better understanding what it is that our youth, the younger generation, and generations to come even, are facing in terms of Islamophobia is so critical and so important, so that we can better understand how to tackle it, how to help guide those who are struggling under the burden of Islamophobia, how to get through it. Now, this is not going to be a political analysis or a discussion of policy and how we can change governmental views in terms of Islamophobia. But instead, I really want to focus on understanding the impact of Islamophobia. What does it look like for our youth and what we can do about it? But before we dive into that, I think it's important to better understand the statistics and recognize what is going on. Some of you may be familiar with the amazing work that the Institute of Social Policy and Understanding does, the organization that's led by Dr. Delia Mugarit. And the work that they do is very groundbreaking because they look into the research in topics such as Islamophobia and getting the pulse of our youth, getting the pulse of our Muslim community. And there's a few studies that were released, research that was done on this topic that I want to share with you to contextualize what we're talking about. So a few years ago, a study was done by the ISPU that looked at the media over the past 25 years. And they found that 90% of media coverage related to Islam or Muslims is negative. They found that the New York Times portrays Islam more negatively than both cancer and cocaine. And if we don't think that matters, then we don't realize the impact and the influence that the subversive nature of the media that we consume can have on our psyche and the way that we view the world around us and the way that we view ourselves. Many of you may be familiar with a study that was conducted many, many years ago where several children, black children, African-American children, were given a choice between dolls, whether they wanted to choose the doll that had white skin and blue eyes, or the doll that had black skin and dark eyes. And they were asked to decide which they thought was more beautiful. And I can't recall the exact percentage, maybe Dr. Altaf recalls, but I know that it was a vast majority of the children that chose the doll with the white skin and the blue eyes. Because the internalization of what Dr. Cornel West had once called the nihilistic threat, the idea that we begin to develop a self-hatred of who we are based on the way that the media views us, based on the way that culture tells us we should look or we should be. So when our youth are going onto Instagram, when our youth are on Snapchat and on TikTok, and they are looking at the images that are infiltrating those mediums and seeing people that look nothing like them. Women who are scantily clad, who do not wear the hijab. Men who are engaged in behaviors that are completely antithetical to the Islamic concepts of values of modesty and haya. And this sometimes becomes that pervasive subcontext that informs how we see ourselves. Now let's take a look at how some of these other statistics play out in day-to-day. Another study that was conducted by ISPU shows that in terms of hate crimes, in Muslim assaults, in the year 2001, that number climbed to 93. And we all know what happened in 2001, after September 11th. Then we see another climb in the year 2016, 127 hate crimes were reported. And we all know what happened in 2016 with our presidential individual. And so we see the spikes and the valleys, and we see how the world around us can impact who we are. Some of you may remember September 11th. Some of you may remember where you were. Some of you may remember what you were doing. Some of you may remember what you were experiencing. For many of our children who were born after 2001, who are now in their teenage and young adult years, they may not have ever known what the world was like before September 11th. And I wanted to share with you a little story of my memories of what the world was like. You know, prior to September 11th, you know, I guess about 9 months before, I actually had September 11th, 2001 circled on my calendar with big red pen. And I had smiley faces all around it. Not because I could ever anticipate what was going to happen, but that was actually my due date for my oldest daughter. She was supposed to be born on September 11th, 2001. That was also the date of my book launch for my first book called The BFF Sisters, which was a book about young Muslim girls growing up in the US. So subhanAllah, you know, during that period of time that year, I was actually working at Standard & Poor's, which is a financial reporting organization, right outside of the World Trade Center. And every day I would take the train, I would walk through the World Trade Center, and I would head to my office. And subhanAllah, my daughter, Aya, who's almost 21 now, she was born a little bit early, so I wound up taking my maternity leave earlier than expected. She was born at the end of August instead of September. And I remember, you know, September 11th, I was holding Aya in my arms, and my husband said, you know, turn on the TV, look at what's happening on TV. And I remember thinking, seriously, he wants me to watch another Seinfeld episode, or, you know, there's probably something with Friends that he wants me to catch. But I turned on the TV. And I couldn't understand why the building that I had worked in for so long was on the news, why there was smoke billowing around it, why the towers that were so familiar to me were crumbling. And I remember watching it thinking, subhanAllah, you know, this must be an accident, somebody flew off the grid, you know, the plane crashed. And I kept wondering. There was a gentleman who worked at the Sbarro's, the pizza place at the World Trade Center, an Egyptian man, who every time I would pass by, he would call out to me, "Assalamu alaikum," and offer me a free slice of pizza. And I remember sitting there that day and thinking, is Muhammad okay? Did he make it out all right? And yet, subhanAllah, little did I know that our lives would completely change following September 11th, 2001. Not because it was my due date, not because it was the day of my book launch, but because it was the day in which America turned to Muslims as the enemy. It was the day in which America decided to point a finger and scapegoat at Muslims, Muslim Americans who had lived and breathed and worked and dreamt and built lives in this country. When America turned to those Muslim Americans and said, you are the outsiders, you don't belong. And since that time, the narrative has strengthened rather than weakened in so many different circles. And we know that the onslaught of 2016, the denigration of immigrants, the put-downs towards Muslim Americans by our own leadership in the American government, we know how that has impacted the landscape and how it has changed the way that the world looks at Muslims again. And yet our youth, subhanAllah, are resilient, because in the face of this hatred, in the face of this pain, our youth have stood up and have arisen to the occasion so many times to show what our deen is about, to lead with their faith. But many have also struggled, and many have also faced anxiety and depression and fears linked to the backlash and the outpouring of hatred and put-downs that they have seen. So we also see that based on a study that was conducted in 2017 and 2018, that Muslims, 38% of young Muslims reported having clinical anxiety post the 2016 election. So the anxiety is real, the fear is real, and again, it's not rooted in just conceptualizations. But Muslims also experience the most religious discrimination at 62%. In a study that was conducted in 2019, 62% of young Muslims identified having been the target of some form of religious discrimination based solely on the fact that they identify as Muslims. This goes even further, where we see that a study conducted also by ISP showed that 42% of Muslim youth in public schools between grades K through 12, 42% experience some type of bullying based on their religious identification. And what's even more heartbreaking is that 1 in 4 of those Muslim bullying incidents involved a teacher. 1 in 4 of the Muslim bullying incidents that our children face in public school K through 12 involve a teacher. And many of us, of course, remember the Ahmed and the clock and the situation in the school. And that was just one of so many, one that was publicized, one of so many that often go unreported, unheard. Why? Because our children sometimes experience this abuse in schools and they are terrified to tell us. Because they are afraid that when they come to their parents and say, I am being bullied, I am being harassed, I am being put down, that their parents may tell them, stand up for yourself. We used to go through this stuff too. We've experienced stuff like this. And this is not the response that our children need. Because first and foremost, we need to indicate that empathy and understand that the world that our children live in today is so different from the world that we grew up in. The pre-911, the pre-9/11 years were very different in the US than what our children are facing. All right, so I just have a couple more statistics to share, and then we're going to talk about what we can do about this. So one of the most beautiful stats that I was looking at from the Institute of Social Policy and Understanding is the recognition that 91% of young Muslims show that strong religious identities are also linked to having strong American identities. Meaning, the strength of conviction, the more confident Muslim youth are in their faith, the more likely they are to be confident in their Americanness, in their feeling of connection and belonging. So it's not a paradox, it's not an oxymoron that if someone is Muslim then they can't be American, but quite the opposite, that our Islam, our faith, our values, our morals, the guidance that our deen gives us makes us better American citizens than if we did not hold on to our faith. And this is the message that we need to continue to encourage our children to understand and to recognize. Because the media, because the government, because their friends, because those who surround them may be telling them the opposite, and they need to hear it from us that that's not the case. And the final, my favorite statistic actually that I saw by ISPU is that Muslims, young Muslims, are among the most likely to say that their faith is a source of happiness. 85% of young Muslims that were polled when they were asked about their source of happiness said that it was their faith. That to me is incredibly beautiful because it tells me that our deen is the guiding light, that the understanding and recognition that facing hardship and difficulty with an open heart, facing hardship and difficulty and knowing that just as the theme of this mass convention reminds us, Inna ma'al usri yusra, that verily with hardship comes ease, that when we empower our children, when we empower our youth to recognize that despite their tests, despite their difficulties, despite the Islamophobia they may face, despite the bullying that they may endure, that they do not have to be silent, that they do have voices and that these are voices that should be used, voices that should be raised in proudly proclaiming La ilaha illallah Muhammadun Rasulullah. And we are the ones who can empower our children and guide them towards this. We are the ones that can nurture within them self-love and care. We are the ones that can encourage them to find that voice of confidence. But we can't do it by turning a blind eye to the very real fears, the very real anxieties, the very real cases of depression. We can't do it by ignoring the negative repercussions that Islamophobia inculcates in our children's minds and hearts. We can only do it by first being aware, recognizing and understanding that these tests exist, recognizing and understanding that the world our children live in is so different from the world we grew up in. Recognizing and understanding that we need to be allies with our children and with our youth, not adversaries, which means we can't stand against them and tell them, grow up, stop being a baby. What are you crying about? Get over it. We need to validate those emotions and tell them it is hard, because it is. It is hard, but you are stronger than that which is hard. It is hard, but you don't need to do it alone. It is hard, but there are resources and there are ways that we can tackle this together. And then we begin. We begin the hard work of advocacy, of education, of awareness, of cultivating safe spaces where our children can talk about what it is that they're experiencing without the fear of being put down or shut up or pushed away. And when we create those safe spaces, when we are able to provide those avenues where our children can speak about what they're experiencing, then we can open pathways to introducing within their school systems, introducing within their communities, within their soccer clubs, within their baseball teams, within all of these different organizations, a way for those around us to better understand our deen and to better understand why, for so many young Muslims, despite the hardship, despite the difficulty, Islam is still the source of their happiness, as it should be. So I pray that Allah Azza wa Jalla protects all of our children from the harms and the evils of Islamophobia, an industry that we know is unfortunately fueled by so much hate and so much meanness and evil-spiritedness. And I pray that Allah Azza wa Jalla empowers us as parents to be able to guide our children through these difficult times. And I pray that Allah Azza wa Jalla surrounds us all with ease in our journeys to raise the next generation. Jazakallahu khair. Assalamu alaikum.